Book the Ninth, Chapter 6 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 6, Confusion Worse Confounded. A cab conveyed Mr. Sheldon swiftly to a dingy street in the city, a street which might have been called the pavement of wasted footsteps, so many an impecunious wretch tramped to and fro upon those dreary flags in vain. The person whom Mr. Sheldon came to see was a distinguished bill discounter, who had served him well in more than one crisis, and on whose service he fancied he could now rely. Mr. K., the bill discounter, was delighted to see his worthy friend Mr. Sheldon. He had just come up from his family at Brighton, and had quite a little court awaiting him in an outer chamber, through which Mr. Sheldon had been ushered to the inner office. "It's rather early for such a visitor as you," Mr. K. said, after a few commonplaces. "I have not been in town half an hour." "My business is too important for any consideration about hours," answered Mr. Sheldon, "or I should not be here at all. I have just come from the death-bed of my wife's daughter." "Indeed!" exclaimed the bill discounter, looking inexpressibly shocked. Until that moment he had lived in supreme ignorance of the fact that Mr. Sheldon had a stepdaughter, but his sorrow-stricken expression of countenance might have implied that he had known and esteemed the young lady. "Yes, it's very sad," said Mr. Sheldon, "and something more than sad for me. The poor girl had great expectations, and would have come into a very fine fortune if she had lived a year or two longer." "Ha, dear me! How very unfortunate! Poor young lady!" "Judd and Doddleson, you know them by repute, of course, have been attending her for the last 6 weeks. There will be no end of expense for me, and it has been all of no use." "Consumption, I suppose?" "Well, no, not pulmonary disease, a kind of atrophy. I scarcely know what to call it. Now look here, Kay, this illness has thrown all my affairs into a muddle. Taken in conjunction with the depressed state of the money market, it has been altogether an upset for me. I have been staying at home looking after this poor girl and my wife, who of course is dreadfully cut up, and that sort of thing, when I ought to have been in the city. Luckily for me and for my wife, in whose interests I acted, I took the precaution to get her daughter's life insured 8 or 9 months ago, in point of fact, immediately after finding she was heir at law to a considerable fortune. The policy is for £5,000. I want you to give me 4,000 immediately upon the strength of the document and of my stepdaughter's will." "Give you 4,000?" exclaimed Mr. K., with a little unctuous laugh. "Do you suppose I keep such a balance as that at my banker's?" "I suppose that you can give me the money if you like." "I might be able to get it for you." "Yes, that's a kind of humbug 100 years old. We've heard all about little Premium and his friend in the City, and so on, from that man who wrote plays and cut a figure in Parliament. You can give me the money on the spot if you like, Kay, and if I didn't want ready money very badly, I shouldn't come to you. The insurance company will give me 5,000 in a month or two. I can give you my bill at 2 months' date, and deposit the policy in your hands as collateral security. I might get this money from other quarters, from my bankers, for instance, but I don't want to let them know too much." Mr. K. deliberated. He had assisted Mr. Sheldon's financial operations, and had profited thereby. Money advanced upon such a security must be as safe as money invested in consols, unless there were anything doubtful in the circumstances of the policy. And that, with a man of Mr. Sheldon's respectability, was to the last degree unlikely. "When do you want this money?" he asked at last. "At the beginning of next week, on the 25th at latest." "And this is the 20th. Sharp work." "Not at all. You could give me the money this afternoon, if you pleased." "Well, I'll think it over. It's a matter in which I feel myself bound to take my solicitor's opinion." "Suppose you meet him here to-morrow at 12 o'clock. You can bring the necessary evidence to support the claim, the doctor's and registrar's certificate, and so on." "Yes," Mr. Sheldon answered thoughtfully. "I will bring the documentary evidence. To-morrow at 12, then." Very little more was said. Mr. Sheldon left the will and the policy in the bill discounter's possession, and departed. Things had gone as smoothly as he could fairly expect them to go. From Mr. Kaye's office he went to the Unitas Bank, where he had a very friendly but not altogether satisfactory interview with the secretary. He wanted the Unitas people to advance him money on the strength of the second policy of assurance, but his balance had been very low of late, and the secretary could not promise compliance with his desires. Those Unitas shares, valued at £5,000, which he had transferred to his beloved stepdaughter, had been transferred by the young lady some months before, with a view to the more profitable investment of the money. This money, as well as all else that Philip Sheldon could command, had gone to the same bottomless pit of unlucky speculation. From the bank the stockbroker went to his office, where he saw Frederick Orcott, to whom he announced his stepdaughter's death with all due appearance of sorrow. He sat for an hour in his office, arranging his affairs for the following day, then sent for another cab and drove back to Bayswater. The noonday press and noise of the city seemed strange to him, almost as they might have seemed to a man newly returned from lonely wanderings in distant wildernesses. The blinds were down at the Lawn. His own handsome bedchamber and adjoining dressing-room faced the road, and it was at the windows of these two rooms he looked. He fancied his weak, foolish wife wailing and lamenting behind those lowered blinds. "And I shall have to endure her lamentations," he thought with a shudder. "I shall have no further excuse for avoiding her. But, on the other hand, I shall have the pleasure of giving Mrs. Woolper and Miss Paget notice to quit." He derived a grim satisfaction from this thought. Yes, insolence from those two women he would endure no longer. The time had come in which he would assert his right to be master in his own house. The game had been played against him boldly by Jedd and these people, and had been lost by them. He was the winner. He could not dismiss doctors, nurse, friend, lover. Charlotte Halliday's death made him master of the situation. He went into his house with the determination to assert his authority at once. Within all was very quiet. He looked into the dining-room. It was quite empty. Into the study, also empty. He went slowly upstairs, composing his face into the appropriate expression. At the door of that chamber, which to him should have seemed of all earthly chambers the most awful, he knocked softly. There was no answer. He knocked a little louder, but there was still no answer. A little louder again, and with the same result. "Is there no one there?" he asked himself. "No one except—" He opened the door and went in, with unshaken nerves, to look upon that one quiet sleeper whom his summons could not awaken, whom his presence could not disturb. There was no nurse or watcher by the bed. Everything was arranged with extreme neatness and precision. But it seemed to him that there were objects missing in the room, objects that had been familiar to him during the dead girl's illness, and which were associated with her presence. The clock that had stood on the table by her bed, a stand of books, a low easy-chair with embroidered cover worked by her mother, and Diana Paget. The room looked blank and empty without these things, and Mr. Sheldon wondered what officious hand had removed them. Yonder stood the pretty little bedstead, shrouded by closely drawn white curtains. Philip Sheldon walked slowly across the room and drew aside one of the curtains. He had looked upon the death sleep of Charlotte Halliday's father. Why not upon hers? She was not there. Those closely drawn curtains shrouded only the bed on which she had slept in the tranquil slumbers of her careless girlhood. That cold, lifeless form, whose rigid outline Philip Sheldon had steeled himself to see, had no place here. He put his hand to his head, bewildered. "What does it mean?" he asked himself. "Surely she died in this room." He went hurriedly to his wife's room. They had taken Charlotte there, perhaps, shortly before her death. Some feverish fancy might have possessed her with the desire to be taken thither. He opened the door and went in, but here again all was blank and empty. The room was arranged after its usual fashion, but of his wife's presence there was no token. His sense of mystification and bewilderment grew suddenly into a sense of fear. What did it mean? What hellish fooling had he been the dupe of? He went to Diana's room. That, too, was empty. A trunk and a portmanteau, covered and strapped as if for removal, occupied the centre of the room. There was no other room upon this floor. Above this floor there were only the rooms of the servants. He went downstairs to the dining-room and rang the bell. The parlour-maid came in answer to his summons. "Where is your mistress?" he asked. "Gone out, sir. She went at 8 o'clock this morning. And, oh, if you please, sir, Dr. Jedd called and said I was to give you this, with the certificate." The certificate! Yes, the certificate of Charlotte Halliday's death, the certificate which he must produce to-morrow, with other evidence for the satisfaction of the bill discounter and his legal adviser. He stared at the girl, still possessed by the sense of bewilderment which had come upon him on seeing those empty rooms upstairs. He took the letter from her almost mechanically and tore it open without looking at the address. The certificate dropped to the ground. He picked it up with a tremulous hand, and for some moments stood staring at it with dazzled, unseeing eyes. He could see that it was a document with dates and names written in a clerkly hand. For some moments he could see no more, and then words and names shone out of the confusion of letters that spun and whirled like motes in the sunshine before his dazzled eyes. Valentine Hawkehurst, bachelor, author, Carlisle Terrace, Edgware Road, son of Arthur Hawkehurst, journalist; Charlotte Halliday, spinster, of the Lawn, Bayswater, daughter of Thomas Halliday, farmer. He read no more. It was a copy of a certificate of marriage, not a certificate of death, that had been brought to him. "You can go," he said to the servant hoarsely. He had a vague consciousness that she was staring at him with curious looks, and that it was not good for him to be watched by any one just now. "About dinner, sir, if you please," the young woman began timidly. "What do I know about dinner?" "You will dine at home, sir?" "Dine at home? Yes. Mrs. Woolper can give you your orders." "Mrs. Woolper is gone out, sir. She has gone for good, I believe, sir. She took her boxes. And Miss Paget's luggage will be sent for, if you please, sir. There's a letter, sir, that Mrs. Woolper left for you on the mantelpiece. She was very good. That will do. You can go." The girl departed, bewildered like her fellow servants by the strangeness of the day's proceedings, still more bewildered by the strangeness of her master's manner. End of chapter 6. Confusion worse confounded. Book the 9th, chapter 7, of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 7. There is a word will Priam turn to stone. When the servant was gone, Mr. Sheldon sat down and examined the document she had given him. Yes, it was in due form, a certified copy of the certificate of a marriage performed that morning at the church of St. Matthias in the Fields, Paddington, and duly witnessed by the registrar of that parish. If this document were indeed genuine, as to all appearance it was, Valentine Hawkehurst and Charlotte Halliday had been married that morning, and the will and the policy of assurance deposited with Mr. K., the bill discounter, were so much waste paper. And they had fooled him, Philip Sheldon, as easily as this. the furious rage which he felt against all these people, and more than against them, against his own besotted folly for allowing himself to be so fooled, was a sharper agony than had ever yet rent his cruel heart. He had been a scoundrel all his life, and had felt some of the pains and penalties of his position, but to be a defeated scoundrel was a new sensation to him, and a savage, impotent hate and anger against himself and the universe took possession of his mind. He walked up and down the room for some time, abandoned wholly to the ungovernable rage that consumed him, and with no thought beyond that blind, useless fury. And then there came upon him the feeling that was almost a part of his mind, the consciousness that something must be done, and promptly. Whatever his position was, he must face it. His hurried pacing to and fro came to a sudden stop, and he took the crumpled document from his packet and examined it once more. There seemed little doubt that it was genuine, and a visit to the church where the marriage was stated to have been performed would immediately place the matter beyond all doubt. With the copy of the certificate he had taken from his pocket the letter that had enclosed it, he saw now that the envelope was addressed in Hawkehurst's hand. Favoured by Dr. Jedd, he had written in a corner of the envelope. Why should Dr. Jedd favour Mr. Hawkehurst's letter? Why, indeed, unless there had been a conspiracy concocted by these men against his authority and his interests? Valentine's letter was brief and businesslike. Sir, with the full approbation of her mother and only near relation, my dear Charlotte has this day become my wife. The enclosed attested copy of the certificate of our marriage will afford you all particulars. I shall refrain from entering upon any explanation of my conduct, and I believe such explanation to be wholly unnecessary. You can scarcely fail to understand why I have acted in this manner, and why I congratulate myself and my dear wife on her departure from your house, as on an escape from imminent peril. It will be, I fear, little satisfaction to you to hear that the doctors have pronounced your stepdaughter to be out of danger, though still in very weak health. She is now comfortably established in a temporary home with her mother and Diana Paget, and in all probability some months must elapse before she and I can begin our new life together. To afford my darling girl the legal protection of marriage was the object of this sudden and secret union. You of all men will most fully comprehend how necessary such protection had become to ensure her safety. Should you, however, require farther enlightenment as to the motives that prompted this step, Dr. Jedd will be the fittest person to give you such information, and has expressed his willingness to answer any questions you may please to put to him. For the rest, I beg to assure you that the rights of Mrs. Hawkehurst in relation to the inheritance of the late John Haygarth's wealth will be as carefully protected as those of Miss Halliday. Nor will the hasty marriage of this morning hinder the execution of any deed of settlement calculated to guard her interests in the future. With this assurance, I remain, sir, your obedient servant, Valentine Hawkehurst, Carlisle Terrace, Edgware Road. Enclosed with this there was a second letter from his wife. He read it with a countenance that expressed mingled anger and contempt. Fool, he muttered, this is about the only service she could do me. The letter was long and incoherent, blotted with tears, in places completely illegible. Mr. Sheldon cared only to master the main facts contained in it, which were these. His wife had left him for ever. Dr. Jedd and Valentine Hawkehurst had told her of something that affected the safety of her darling and only child, and the knowledge of which must separate her for ever from him. Of the money which she had brought to him she claimed nothing. even her jewels, which were in his keeping, in the iron safe where he kept his papers, she did not attempt to obtain from him. Valentine would not allow her to starve. The humblest shelter, the poorest food would suffice her in the future, but no home of his providing could she ever inhabit again. "What I have suffered in this last few days is only known to myself and to Heaven," she wrote. "Oh, Philip, how could you even shape the thought of such a deed as this, which you have been doing day after day for the last 2 months? I could not have believed what they have told me if I had not seen my child fade hour by hour under your care, slowly, surely, and recover as surely directly you were excluded from any part in our care of her. If it were possible not to believe these people, I would disbelieve them, and would cling to you faithfully still, but the voices against you are too many, the proofs against you are too strong. Do not seek to see me. I am with my poor child, who was but just able to bear the removal from your house and to go through the ceremony that was performed this morning. Little did I ever think my daughter would have such a wedding. What a mockery all my plans seem now! And I had chosen the 6 bridesmaids and arranged all the dresses in my own mind. To see my dear girl dressed anyhow, in her oldest bonnet, standing before the altar, huddled up in a shawl, and given away by a strange doctor, who kept looking at his watch in a most disrespectful manner during the ceremony, was very bitter to me." Mr. Sheldon flung aside the letter with an oath. He had no time to waste upon such twaddle as this. He tore open Nancy Woolper's letter. It was a poor honest scrawl, telling him how faithfully she had served him, how truly she had loved him in the past, and how she could henceforth serve him no more. It exhorted him in humble, ill-spelt phrases to repentance. It might not yet be too late even for such a sinner as he had been. He tore these 2 epistles into infinitesimal fragments and flung them into the fireplace. Valentine Hawkehurst's letter he kept. It was a document of some legal importance. For a moment there had flashed across his brain the thought that he might punish these people for their interference with his affairs. He might bring an action against Dr. Jedd for slander, and compel the physician to prove the charges insinuated against him, or pay the penalty attendant upon an unjustifiable accusation. He was well assured that Dr. Jedd could prove very little, and a jury, if properly worked, might award him exemplary damages. But on the other hand, the circumstantial evidence against him was very strong, and evidence which might be insufficient to prove him guilty in a trial for his life might be a sufficient defence for his enemies against an action for slander, if indeed the course which Dr. Jedd and Valentine Hawkehurst had taken did in itself constitute a slanderous and malicious imputation. Nor could any such action invalidate the marriage solemnized that morning, and that one fact comprised his utter ruin. Charlotte's interests were merged in the interests of her husband. No shadow of claim upon John Haygarth's wealth remained to him. His ruin was complete and dire. For a long time his circumstances had been desperate, no avenue of escape open to him but the one dark way which he had trodden, and now that last road was closed against him. The day was very near at hand when his fictitious bills on shadowy companies must be dishonoured, and with the dishonour of those bills came the end of all things for him, a complete revelation of all those dishonest artifices by which he had kept his piratical bark afloat on the commercial waters. He surveyed his position in every light calmly and deliberately, and saw there was no hope. The whole scheme of his existence was reduced to the question of how much ready money he could carry out of that house in his pocket, and in what direction he should betake himself after leaving it. His first care must be to ascertain whether the marriage described in the duplicate certificate had really taken place. his next to repossess himself of the papers left with Mr. K. Before leaving the house, he went to his study, where he examined his banker's book. Yes, it was as they had told him at the bank. He was overdrawn. Among the letters lying unopened on his writing table, he found a letter from one of the officials of the Unitas, calling his attention politely and respectfully to that oversight upon his part. He read the letter and crumpled it into his pocket with an angry gesture. "I'm just about as well off now as I was 12 years ago, before Tom Halliday came to Fitzgeorge Street," he said to himself, "and I have the advantage of being 12 years older." Yes, this is what it all came to after all. He had been travelling in a circle. The discovery was humiliating. Mr. Sheldon began to think that his line of life had not been a paying one. He opened his iron safe and forced the lock of the jewel case in which his wife had kept the few handsome ornaments that he had given her in the early days of their marriage, as a reward for being good, that is to say, for allowing her second husband to dispose of her first husband's patrimony without let or hindrance. The jewels were only a few rings, a brooch, a pair of earrings, and a bracelet, but they were good of their kind, and in all worth something like £200. These, and the gold chronometer which he carried in his waistcoat pocket, constituted all the worldly wealth which Mr. Sheldon could command, now that the volcanic ground upon which his commercial position had been built began to crumble beneath his feet, and the bubbling of the crater warned him of his peril. He put the trinkets into his pocket without compunction, and then went upstairs to his dressing-room, where he proceeded to pack his clothes in a capacious portmanteau, which in itself might constitute his credentials among strangers, so eminently respectable was its appearance. In this dread crisis of his life, he thought of everything that affected his own interests. To what was he going? That question was for the moment unanswerable. In every quarter of the globe there are happy hunting grounds for the soldier of fortune. Some plan for the future would shape itself in his mind by and by. His wife's desertion had left him thoroughly independent. He had no tie to restrain his movements, nothing to dread except such proceedings as might be taken against him by the holders of those bills. And such proceedings are slow, while modern locomotion is swift. What was he leaving? That was easily answered. A labyrinth of debt and difficulty. The fine house, the handsome furniture, were held in the same bondage of the law as his household goods in Fitzgeorge Street had been. He had given a bill of sale upon everything he possessed 6 months before to obtain ready money. The final terrible resource had not been resorted to until all other means had been exhausted. Let this fact at least be recorded to his credit. He was like the lady whom the poet sings, who, tolerably mild, to make a wash, would hardly boil a child. That is to say, she would try all other materials for her cosmetic preparation first, and if they failed, would at last resort unwillingly to the boiling of children. No, he had nothing to lose by flight. Of that fact it was easy for him to assure himself. He went downstairs and rang for the servant. "I'm going out," he said, "to join my wife and her daughter, and return with them to the seaside. There is a portmanteau upstairs in my room, ready packed. You will give it to the messenger I shall send in the course of the next day or two. At what time did Mrs. Sheldon and Miss Halliday leave this morning?" "At 8 o'clock, sir. Mr. Hawkehurst came to fetch them in a carriage. They went out by the kitchen passage and the side gate, sir, because you were asleep, Mrs. Woolper said, and was not to be disturbed." "At 8, yes. And Mrs. Woolper and Miss Paget?" "They went a'most directly after you was gone out, sir. There was 2 cabs to take Miss Halliday's and Mrs. Sheldon's things and such like, just as there was when you came from Harold's Hill." "Yes, I understand." He was half inclined to ask the young woman if she had heard the direction given to the drivers of these two cabs, but he refrained from doing so. What could it profit him to know where his wife and stepdaughter were to be found? Whether they were in the next street or at the Antipodes could matter very little to him, except so far as the knowledge of their place of habitation might guide him in his avoidance of them. Between him and them there was a gulf wider than all the waters of the world, and to consider them was only foolish waste of time and thought. He left the house which for the last 5 years of his life had been the outward and visible sign of his social status, fully conscious that he left it for ever, and he left it without a sigh. For him the word home had no tender associations, and the domestic hearth had never inspired him with any sense of comfort or pleasure with which he might not have been inspired by the luxurious fireside of a first-class coffee-room. He was a man who would have chosen to spend his existence in joint-stock hotels if there had not been solidity of position to be acquired from the possession of a handsome house. He went to the Paddington Church. It was only 5 o'clock in the afternoon by the clock of that edifice. The church was closely shut, but Mr. Sheldon found the clerk, who, in consideration of a handsome donation, took him to the vestry, and there showed him the register of marriages, the last entry therein. Yes, there was Charlotte Halliday's signature, a little uncertain and tremulous. "I suppose you are one of the young lady's relations, sir?" said the clerk. It was rather a strange affair, but the young lady's ma was with her, and the young lady was over age, so you see there's nothing to be said against it. Mr. Sheldon had nothing to say against the marriage. If any false statement of his, however base or cruel, could have invalidated the ceremonial, he would have spared no pains to devise such a falsehood. If he had been a citizen of the Southern States, he might have suborned witnesses to prove that there was black blood in the veins of Valentine Hawkehurst. If he had not been opposed to so strong an opponent as Dr. Jedd, he might have tried to get a commission of lunacy to declare Charlotte Halliday a madwoman, and thus invalidate her marriage. As it was, he knew that he could do nothing. He had failed. All was said in those 3 words. He wasted no time at the church, but hurried on to the city, where he was just in time to catch Mr. Kaye leaving his office. "Have you sent those papers to your solicitor?" he asked. "No, I was just going to take them round to him. I have been thinking that it will be necessary to ascertain that there is no will of Miss Halliday's subsequent to this, and that will be rather difficult to find out. Women never know when to leave off making wills if they once begin making them. They have a positive rage for multiplying documents, you know. If the testator in that great codicil case had been a woman, a jury would scarcely have refused to believe in the story of half a dozen different codicils hidden away in half a dozen different holes and corners. Women like that sort of thing. Of course, I quite understand that you bring me the will in all good faith, but I foresee difficulties in raising money upon such a security." "You need give yourself no further trouble about the matter," said Mr. Sheldon coolly. "I find that I can do without the money, and I've come to reclaim the papers." Mr. Kaye handed them to his client. He was not altogether pleased by this turn of affairs, for he had expected to profit considerably by Mr. Sheldon's necessities. That gentleman honoured him with no further explanations, but put the papers in his pocket, and wished the bill discounter good day. And this was the last time that Philip Sheldon was ever seen in his character of a solid and respectable citizen of London. He went from the bill discounter's office to a pawnbroker in the city, with whom he pledged Georgie's trinkets and his own watch for the sum of £120. From the pawnbroker's he went back to Bayswater for his portmanteau, and thence to the Euston Hotel, where he dined temperately in the coffee-room. After dinner he went out into the dull back streets that lurk behind Euston Square, and found an obscure little barber's shop, where he had his whiskers shaved off, and his hyacinthine locks cropped as close as the barber's big scissors could crop them. The sacrifice of these hirsute adornments made an extraordinary change in this man. All the worst characteristics of his countenance came out with a new force, and the face of Mr. Sheldon, undisguised by the whiskers that had hidden the corners of his mouth, or the waving locks that had given height and breadth to his forehead, was a face that no one would be likely to trust. From the Euston Station he departed by the night mail for Liverpool under the cover of darkness. In that city he quietly awaited the departure of the Cunard steamer for New York, and was so fortunate as to leave England one day before that fatal date on which the first of his fictitious bills arrived at maturity. End of Chapter 7. There is a word will Priam turn to stone. Book the 10th, Chapter 1 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Book the 10th, Harbour After Many Shipwrecks. Chapter 1, Out of the Dark Valley. Not with pomp or with splendour, with rejoicing or strewing of summer blossoms in the pathway of bride and bridegroom, had the marriage of Valentine and Charlotte been solemnized. Simple and secret had been the ceremonial. Dark with clouds was the sky above them, and yet it is doubtful if happier bridegroom ever trod this earth than Valentine Hawkehurst, as he went to his lonely lodging under the starry summer sky, after leaving his young wife to her mother's care in the new home that had been found for them. He had reason to rejoice, for he had passed through the valley of the shadow of death. He had seen very near that dread presence before which the angels of faith and love can avail nothing. Fearless as Alcides had he gone down to the realms of darkness. Triumphant and glad as the demigod, he returned from the underworld, bearing his precious burden in his strong arms. The struggle had been dire, the agony of suspense a supreme torture, but from the awful contest the man came forth a better and a wiser man. Whatever strength of principle had been wanting to complete the work of reformation inaugurated by love had been gained by Valentine Hawkehurst during the period of Charlotte's illness. His promised wife, his redeeming angel, she for whose affection he had first learned to render thanks to his God, had seemed to be slipping away from him. In the happiest hour of his prosperous courtship he had known himself unworthy of her, with no right, no claim to so fair a prize, except the right of pure and unselfish love. When the hour of trial came to him, he had said, "Behold the avenger!" and in that hour it seemed to him that a lurking anticipation of future woe had been ever present with him in the midst of his happiness. It seemed so natural, so reasonable, that this treasure should be taken away from him. What had he done that he should go unpunished for all the errors and follies of his youth? He looked back and asked himself if he had been so vile a sinner as in these hours of self-reproach he was inclined to esteem himself. Could his life have been otherwise? Had he not been set in a groove, his young feet planted in the crooked ways, before he knew that life's journey might be travelled by a straighter road? Alas, the answer given at the tribunal of conscience went against him. Other men had come into this world amidst surroundings as bad, nay, indeed worse than the surroundings of his cradle, and of these men some had emerged from their native mire spotless and pure as from newly fallen snow. The natural force of character which had saved these men had not been given to him. His feet had been set in the crooked ways, and he had travelled on reckless, defiant, dimly conscious that the road was a bad one, and that his garments were bespattered with more mud stains than would be agreeable to some travellers. It was only when the all-powerful influence of love was brought to bear upon this plastic nature that Valentine Hawkehurst became fully awakened to the degradation of his position, and possessed with an earnest desire to emerge from the great dismal swamp of bad company. Then, and then only, began the transformation which was ultimately to become so complete a change. Some influence, even beyond that of happy love, was needed to give force to this man's character, and in the great terror of the last 3 months that influence had been found. The very foundations of Valentine Hawkehurst's life had been shaken, and, come what might, he could never be again what he had been. He had almost lost her. All was said in that. She had been almost taken from him, she who to this man was father, mother, wife, household, past, present, future, glory, ambition, happiness, everything except that God who ruled above and held her life and his peace in the hollow of his hand. He had been face to face with death, and never in all the years to come, never in the brightest hour of future happiness could he forget the peril that had come upon him and might come again. He had learned to understand that he held her not as a free gift, but as a loan, a treasure to be reclaimed at any moment by the God who lent her. The darksome valley was past, and Valentine stood by his darling's side, safe upon the sunlit uplands. The doctors had declared their patient safe. The hour of danger had been passed in safety, and the mischief worked by the poisoner's slow process had been well nigh counteracted by medical skill. In 6 weeks' time you may take your wife for her honeymoon tour, Mr. Hawkehurst, with her health and spirits thoroughly re-established, said Dr. Jedd. "What is that you say about honeymoon tours?" cried Gustave Lenoble. "Hawkehurst and his wife will spend their honeymoon at Côtenoir, is it not, Diana?" Diana replied that it was to be and must be so. It was impossible to imagine a happier party than that which met day after day in those pleasant lodgings at Kilburn, wherein Georgie and Diana and Charlotte had been established with much devotion and care on the parts of Valentine and Gustave. Mr. Hawkehurst had chosen the apartments, and M. Lenoble had spent the day before the wedding in rushing to and fro between the West End and Kilburn, carrying hothouse flowers, comestibles of all kinds from Fortnum and Mason's, bonbon boxes, perfumery, new books, new music, and superintending the delivery of luxurious easy chairs hired from expensive upholsterers, a grand piano, and a harmonium. "We will have music in the evenings," he said to Diana, upon her expressing surprise on beholding these arrangements, "when we are assembled here all. How thou dost open thine eyes on beholding these nothings! Do you think it has been no pleasure to me to testify my affection for one who has been so good to thee, thy friend, thine adopted sister? I wished that all things should look bright around her when they brought her here. After that, she had come to escape from the jaws of death. And thou, was it not that thou wert also coming to make thy home here for some days, until thy day of marriage? Thy father astonishes himself to hear of such sudden events. Thou wilt go to see him soon, is it not?" "Yes, dear Gustave, I will go to morrow." She went on the next day, and found Captain Paget much weaker than on her last visit. It was evident that for him the end was very near. He was much changed and subdued by his long illness, but the spirit of worldliness had not been altogether exorcised, even in this dismal period of self-communion. "What does it all mean, Diana?" he asked. "I don't understand being kept in the dark like this. Here are you, suddenly leaving Mr. Sheldon's house without rhyme or reason, to take up your quarters in lodgings with Mrs. Sheldon. Here is a mysterious marriage taking place at a time when I have been given to understand that one of the parties is at death's door. And here is Lenoble introduced to Valentine Hawkehurst, in express opposition to my particular request that my future son-in-law should be introduced to none of the Sheldon set." Valentine is not one of the Sheldon set, papa. I do not think it likely that he will ever see Philip Sheldon again." "Bless my soul!" exclaimed Captain Paget. "There has been something serious going on, then, surely." After this he insisted on an explanation, and Diana told him the story of the last 2 or 3 weeks, Charlotte's increasing illness, so mysterious and incurable, the sudden return from Harold's Hill, Valentine's fears, Dr. Jedd's boldly expressed opinion that the patient was the victim of foul play, the systematic exclusion of Philip Sheldon from the sick room, followed immediately by symptoms of amelioration, leading to gradual recovery. All this Captain Paget heard with an awe-stricken countenance. The distance that divides the shedder of blood from all other wrong-doers is so great that the minor sinner feels himself a saint when he contemplates the guilt of the greater criminal. "Great God! Is this possible?" exclaimed the Captain with a shudder. "And I have taken that man's hand!" Later in the evening, when Diana had left him, and he had been thinking seriously of his own career and those many transactions of his troubled life, which, in the slang denomination of the day, would be called shady, he derived some scrap of comfort from one consideration. "I never hurt a worm," he murmured to himself complacently. "No, I can lay my hand upon my heart and say, I never hurt a worm." The Captain did not pause to reflect that some of the merit involved in this amiable trait of character might have been referable to the fact that he had never happened to fall upon a state of society in which a comfortable living was to be made by the hurting of worms. He thought only of the story he had heard about Philip Sheldon, and he told himself that not in the direst necessity of his life could his brain have fashioned the thought of such a deed as that, in the doing of which this man had persevered for nearly 3 months. For Charlotte Hawkehurst, the summer days which succeeded her marriage passed very quietly. She had not been told the real motive of that hasty and stolen marriage which had given her to the man she loved and trusted so completely. Valentine and Diana had between them contrived to mould Mrs. Sheldon to their will, and it was at her request that Charlotte had consented to so strange a step. The fable invented to account for this desire on the part of Mrs. Sheldon was very innocent. The doctors had ordered a milder climate than England for the dear convalescent, Madeira, Algeria, Malta, or some other equally remote quarter of the globe. It was impossible that Mr. or Mrs. Sheldon could take so long a journey, Mr. Sheldon being bound hand and foot to the mill wheel of city life, Mrs. Sheldon being the slave and helpmeet of her husband. Nor could dear Charlotte go to Malta alone, or attended only by faithful Diana Paget. In short, there was no course so obvious or so prudent as a hasty marriage, which would enable the invalid to seek a milder clime, accompanied and guarded by her natural protector, a husband. "Consent, dearest, I entreat you," wrote Valentine in the little note which supported Mrs. Sheldon's request. "However strange our wishes may seem to you, believe that it is for the best, for your own sake, for the sake of all who love you, and ask no questions. Say only yes." To the prayer in this letter, to the entreaties of her mother and Diana, Charlotte yielded. She wondered why Mr. Sheldon avoided her, and asked anxiously, on more than one occasion, why she did not see that gentleman. "Is papa ill?" she asked, "that he never comes to see how I am?" "The doctors have forbidden many people in your room, dear." "Yes, a few days ago, when I was so very ill. But now that I am better, papa might come. I want to thank him for all his anxious care of me, and to be sure that he consents to this marriage." "My darling, be assured the marriage is for the best," pleaded Diana, and the marriage took place. Charlotte's innocent soul was thus spared the pain of a revelation which must have cast a dark shadow on the bright beginning of her wedded life. Georgie pledged herself to keep the fatal secret from her daughter, and Diana Paget rewarded her discretion by the most patient attention to her piteous and prosy lamentations upon the iniquity of mankind in general, and Philip Sheldon in particular. Of that hideous secret of the past, lately revealed by Mr. Burkham, Mrs. Sheldon had been told nothing. No good end could have been served by such a revelation. The criminal law has its statute of limitations, unwritten but not the less existent. A crime which would have been difficult of proof at the time of its commission must, after the lapse of 12 years, have travelled beyond the pale of justice. For 3 people to come forward and declare that at the time of Mr. Halliday's death they had suspected Mr. Sheldon of poisoning him would be to prove nothing to the minds of a British jury, except that the 3 people in question were libellous and ill-disposed persons. The greater the issue, the wider the chances of escape given to the accused, and a petty offender will be condemned for picking a pocket upon much lighter grounds than will be considered sufficient to prove a man guilty of blowing up the Houses of Parliament. End of Chapter 1. Out of the Dark Valley. Book the 10th, Chapter 2, of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 2, After the Wedding. The manner in which Mr. Sheldon would act in the future was a matter of considerable fear to his wife. She had a hazy idea that he would come to the pleasant Kilburn lodgings to claim her, and insist upon her sharing his dreary future. "If I could only have a divorce," she said piteously, when she discussed the subject with her son-in-law. "There ought to be divorces for such dreadful things, but I never heard of one before Sir Creswick, or the new judge, whose name I can't remember. Oh, Valentine, I cannot live with him. I cannot sit down to dinner day after day with such a man as that. And to think that I should have known him when I was the merest girl, and have danced my very first polka with him when it first came in, and people wore polka boots and polka jackets, and wrote their notes of invitation upon polka paper, and sang polka songs, and worked polking peasants in Berlin wool, and went on altogether in the most absurd manner. And, oh, Valentine, whom can one trust, if not the man one has known all one's life?" Mr. Hawkehurst pledged himself to protect his mother-in-law from any attempt at persecution upon the part of her husband. He did not know what difficulties he might have to encounter in the performance of this pledge, for in his ignorance of the stockbroker's desperate circumstances, he imagined that Philip Sheldon would make some attempt to right himself in the eyes of the world by compelling his wife to reassume her position in his house. He went to George Sheldon's office within a few days after his marriage to take counsel from that astute adviser. He found the lawyer hard at work and in very good spirits. It was by his advice the marriage had been hurried on. Charlotte's stealthy removal from the house while Philip Sheldon slumbered had been planned by him, and he was triumphant in the thought that the plot had succeeded so well, and that Philip, the coolest and deepest of schemers, had been so completely baffled. "That Ann Woolper is a treasure," he said. "I didn't think it was in her to do what she has done. Nothing could be neater than the way she kept Phil at bay, and nothing could be better than her tact and cleverness in getting Charlotte and her mother quietly off the other morning, while my precious brother was in the land of Nod. Yes, she has been invaluable to us. And that girl Paget, too, she has turned out a regular trump. I used to think her a very stiff, consequential piece of goods when I saw her at the Lawn, but, egad, she has shown herself the genuine metal all through this business. Now that's a young woman I wouldn't mind making Mrs. George Sheldon any day in the week." "You do her too much honour," said Valentine, with an internal shiver. "Unhappily, a prior engagement will prevent Miss Paget's availing herself of so excellent an opportunity." "It mayn't be such a very bad chance as you seem to think it, my friend," George replied, with some indignation. "Whenever the Reverend John Haygarth's estate drops in, I stand to win £50,000, and that's not so bad for a start in life. I suppose you haven't forgotten that your wife is heir at law to £100,000. "No, I have not forgotten her position in relation to the Haygarth estate." "Humph! I should rather think not. People don't generally forget that kind of thing. But you are uncommonly cool about the business." "Yes, I have passed through a fiery furnace in which all the bullion in the Bank of England will not serve a man. That kind of ordeal upsets one's old notions as to the value of money. And again, I have never been able to contemplate Charlotte's inheritance of that fortune as anything but a remote contingency. The business is so slow." "Yes, but it has been going on. Affidavits have been made. The whole affair is in progress." "I am glad to hear it. Don't think that I pretend not to value the prospect of wealth. I have only learnt to know that money is not the be-all and end-all of life. I could be very happy with my dear wife if there were no prospect of this Haygarthian inheritance. But if it does come to us, we shall no doubt be all the happier. The millionaire sees the world from a very pleasant point of view. I should like my dear girl to be the mistress of as fair a home as money can buy for her." "Yes, and you'd like to have your name stand high in the statistics of government stockholders. Don't be sentimental, Hawkehurst. That kind of thing won't wash. Thank God we managed to save poor Tom's daughter from the fangs of my brother Phil. But you can't suppose that I am going to shut my eyes to the fact that this affair has been a very good thing for you, and that you owe your chances of a great fortune entirely to me. You don't pretend to forget that, I suppose?" said George Sheldon, with some acrimony. "Why should I pretend to forget that, or any circumstance of our business relations? I am perfectly aware that you started the hunt of the Haygarths, and that to your investigations is to be traced the discovery that proves my wife a claimant to the estate now held by the Crown." "Very good. That's outspoken and honest, at any rate. And now, how about our agreement? It's only a parole agreement, but an honest man's word is as good as his bond." "Our agreement!" repeated Valentine, with a puzzled expression of countenance. "Upon my word, I forget." "Ah, I thought it would come to that. I thought you would manage to forget the terms agreed upon by you and me in the event of your marriage with Charlotte Halliday. My memory is not so short as yours, and I can swear to a conversation between you and me in this room, in which you consented to my taking half the Haygarthian estate as the price of my discovery and the fair reward of my labours." "Yes," said Valentine, "I remember that conversation, and I remember saying that the demand was a stiff one, but that I, as Charlotte's future husband, would not oppose such a demand." "You remember that?" "I do, and if my wife is willing to consent to your terms, I will hold to my promise." "Your wife's consent is not wanted. She married you without a settlement, and her rights are merged in yours. To all intents and purposes, you are heir at law to John Haygarth's estate." Valentine laughed aloud. The whole affair seemed a tremendous joke. He, the homeless, penniless, friendless reprobate of but 1 year ago, he, the son and heir of a man who had been always on the verge of social shipwreck for want of £5, he, of all other men upon this earth, claimant against the Crown for an estate worth £100,000. "The whole affair seems ridiculously improbable," he said. "My brother wouldn't have done what he did if the whole thing had seemed improbable to him. However, we needn't estimate the chances for or against. All I want is a legal agreement between you and me, securing my share of the plunder. I am ready to execute any reasonable agreement, but I am bound to protect my wife's interests, and I must have a solicitor to act for me in this affair. Greek must meet Greek, you know." Very good. I could have conducted the business myself without the interference of strangers, but if you are going in for extreme caution, you'd better leave your wife's affairs in the hands of Messrs. Greenwood and Greenwood, who have acted for her hitherto, and have all papers relating to the case in their possession. Greenwood and Greenwood. My dear girl told me she had signed some document and had seen some lawyers, but she did not tell me the nature of the document or the name of the lawyers. I have forborne to speak to her on business matters. The treatment that she has undergone has left her very nervous, and we try to keep all unpleasant subjects out of her mind. Yes, that's all very well, but business is business, you know. You'd better see Messrs. Greenwood and Greenwood at once. Tell them of your marriage. You'll have to keep Phil's conduct dark, of course. That is understood between us. You must say the marriage was a love match against my brother's wish, romantic, sentimental, and so on. They'll raise no objections when they find you are willing to leave the case in their hands. You've heard nothing of your brother? Well, no, nothing, or next to nothing. I called at his office yesterday. He has not been there since the beginning of Charlotte's illness, and there has been no letter or message for Orcott since your wedding day. Things look rather piscatorial altogether. Orcott hints that Phil's affairs are in Queer Street, but he's a shallow-headed fool and knows very little. It seems, by his account, that Phil was a bull, and that the fall in every species of stock has been ruin to him. You see, when a man once goes in for the bull business, he never by any chance turns bear, and vice versa. There's a kind of infatuation in the thing, and a man sticks to his line until he's cleaned out. At least that's what stockbrokers have told me, and I believe it's pretty near the truth. This was all that Valentine could ascertain about Mr. Sheldon at present. Every knock fluttered Georgie. Every accidental visitor at the Kilburn villa seemed like the swooping of eagle on dovecote. "I cannot get over the feeling that he will come and take me away with him," she said. "If Sir Wilde Creswick would only do something, so that my second husband mayn't be able to insist upon my living in that dreadful, dreadful house, where I suffered such nights and days of agony that I am convinced the sight of chintz curtains lined with pink will make me wretched as long as I live." "My dear Mrs. Sheldon, he shall not come," said Valentine. "If I could only go ever so far away from him, and feel that there was the sea, or something of that kind, between us." "We will take you away across the British Channel, or further still, if you like. Diana and Monsieur Lenoble are to be married soon, and directly Lotta is strong enough for the journey we are to go over to Normandy, to their chateau." "Chateau, indeed!" Mrs. Sheldon explained peevishly. "The idea of Diana Paget without a sixpence, and with a regular scamp of a father, marrying a man with a chateau, while my poor Charlotte— I don't wish to wound your feelings, Mr. Hawkehurst, but it really does seem hard." "It is hard that Lotta should not have married a prince. All the grandeurs of a prince in a fairy tale would only be her due. But it happens, fortunately, you see, dear Mrs. Sheldon, that our sweet girl has simple tastes, and does not languish for jewels or palaces. If she should ever become rich—" "Ah!" sighed Georgie despondently, "I don't expect that. I can't understand anything about this idea of a fine fortune that Mr. Sheldon had got into his head. I know that my husband's mother was a Miss Meynell, the daughter of a carpet warehouseman in the city, and I can't see how any grand fortune is to come to Charlotte through her. And as for the Hallidays, Hyley and Newhall farms were all the property they ever owned within the memory of man. The fortune for which Charlotte is a claimant comes from the maternal ancestor of Christian Meynell. I do not count upon her possession of it as a certain good in the future. If it comes, we will be thankful." "Is it a very large sum of money?" "Well, yes, I believe it is a considerable sum." £20,000, perhaps?" "I have been told that it is as much." He did not want Georgie's weak mind to become possessed of the idea of shadowy wealth. He remembered what Philip Sheldon had said to him on the Christmas night in which they had placed the little Bayswater garden together, and he felt that there was a substratum of common sense in that scoundrel's artful warning. End of chapter 2. After the wedding. Book the 10th, chapter 3 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 3, Greek against Greek. Valentine Hawkehurst called upon Mr. Greenwood of the firm of Greenwood and Greenwood within a week of his marriage, and exhibited the certificate to that gentleman. Mr. Greenwood received the information with much solemnity and even severity of manner. "Are you aware that this is a very serious step which you have taken, Mr. Hawkehurst?" he demanded sternly. "You entrap, that is to say, you persuade a lady into a hasty marriage without consultation with her legal advisers, without settlements of any kind whatever, while at the same time you are aware that the lady in question is heir at law to a very large fortune, proceedings for the recovery of which are now pending. Pardon me if I observe that there is a want of delicacy, of right-mindedness in the transaction." "The imputation contained in your remarks is not a pleasant one, Mr. Greenwood," Valentine remarked quietly, "but I am quite willing to pardon any injustice which you may inflict upon me by your desire to protect the interests of your client. I think you will speedily discover that those interests are in no way endangered by the lady's marriage with me. There are social complications which are not to be settled by either law or equity. Miss Halliday's surroundings of the last few months were of a very painful nature, so painful that the legal protection of marriage became the only means of saving her from imminent peril. I cannot enter more fully into those painful circumstances. I can only assure you that I married your client with the consent and approval of her only near relation, and uninfluenced in the smallest degree by mercenary considerations. Whatever post-nuptial settlement you please to make for my wife's protection, I shall promptly execute." "You express yourself in a very honourable and highly creditable manner, Mr. Hawkehurst," exclaimed the lawyer, with sudden cordiality, "and I beg distinctly to withdraw any offensive observations I may have made just now. Your own affairs are, I conclude, in a sufficiently solvent state?" "I do not owe a sixpence." "Good. And Mr. Sheldon, the lady's stepfather and my client, had you his approval for this hasty marriage?" "The marriage took place without Mr. Sheldon's knowledge or consent." "May I ask your reason for this secrecy?" "No, Mr. Greenwood. It is just that one reason that I cannot tell you. Accept my assurance that it was an all-powerful reason." "I am compelled to do so, if you decline to confide in my discretion. But as Mr. Sheldon is my client, I am bound to think of his interests as well as those of Miss Halliday, Mrs. Hawkehurst. I am somewhat surprised that he has not called upon me since the marriage. He has been made aware of that circumstance, I suppose?" "Yes, I wrote to him immediately after the ceremony, enclosing him a copy of the certificate." "The marriage will make a considerable difference to him." "In what manner?" "Well, in the event of his stepdaughter's death. If she had died unmarried and intestate, this fortune would have gone to her mother, besides which there was the insurance on Miss Halliday's life." "An insurance?" "Yes. Were you not apprised of that fact? Mr. Sheldon, with very natural precaution, insured his stepdaughter's life for a considerable sum. In point of fact, as I believe, £5,000, so that in case of her death prior to the recovery of the Haygarth estate, her mother might receive some solatium." "He had insured her life?" said Valentine under his breath. This, then, was the key to the mystery. The Haygarthian inheritance was but a remote contingency, a shadowy prize, which could scarcely have tempted the secret assassin, but the insurance had offered the prospect of immediate gain. The one link wanting to complete the chain of evidence against Philip Sheldon was found. There was no longer a question as to his motive. This man knows of one insurance on her life, Valentine thought to himself. There may have been more than one. After a brief silence, in which Mr. Hawkehurst had been lost in thought, the lawyer proceeded to discuss the terms of the post-nuptial settlement necessary for the protection of his client's interests. In the course of this discussion, Valentine explained his position in relation to George Sheldon, and stated the demands of that sharp practitioner. Mr. Greenwood was utterly aghast upon hearing Mr. Hawkehurst's views on this subject. "You mean to tell me that this man claims a clear half of the Haygarth estate, £50,000, in consideration of his paltry discoveries? Such is the demand he has made, and which I have pledged myself not to oppose. He certainly does open his mouth very wide, but we are bound to consider that but for these discoveries of his, my wife and my wife's relatives would in all probability have gone down to their graves in ignorance of their claim to this estate." "I beg your pardon, Mr. Hawkehurst. If Mr. George Sheldon had not made the discovery, some one else would have made it sooner or later, depend upon it. There would have been a little loss of time, that is all. There are plenty of men of George Sheldon's class always on the look-out for such chances as this, and for very small chances in comparison to this. Why, I know a fellow, a Frenchman, called Fleurus, who will take as much trouble about a few £100 worth of unclaimed stock as this man George Sheldon has taken about the Haygarth succession. And he has really the impudence to claim £50,000 from you?" "A claim which I have pledged myself not to oppose." "But which you have not pledged yourself to support. My dear Mr. Hawkehurst, this is a business which you must allow me to settle for you, as your wife's legal adviser. We will consider you quite out of the question, if you please. You will thus come out of your relations to Mr. George Sheldon with perfectly clean hands. You will not oppose his claim, but I shall oppose him in my character of legal adviser to your wife. Why, are you aware that this man executed an agreement with his brother, consenting to receive a fifth share of the estate, and costs out of pocket, in complete acquittance of all claims? I have an abstract of the agreement amongst Miss Halliday's, Mrs. Hawkehurst's, papers." After some further discussion, Valentine agreed to leave the whole matter in Mr. Greenwood's hands. Greek must meet Greek. Gray's Inn and the Fields must settle this business between themselves. "I am only Prince Consort," he said with a smile. "I pretend to no actual interest in my wife's estate. I doubt, indeed, whether I should not have felt more complete happiness in our marriage if she had not been heiress to so large a fortune." At this Mr. Greenwood laughed outright. "Come, come, Mr. Hawkehurst," he exclaimed, "that really won't do. I am an old stager, you know, a man of the world, and you mustn't ask me to believe that the idea of your wife's expectations can afford you anything but unqualified satisfaction." "You cannot believe? No, perhaps not," Valentine answered thoughtfully. "But you do not know how nearly these expectations have lost me my wife. And even now, when she is mine by virtue of a bond that only death can loosen, it seems to me as if her wealth would make a kind of division between us. There are people who will always consider me a lucky adventurer, and look at my marriage as the result of clever scheming. I cannot advertise to the world the fact that I loved Charlotte Halliday from the first hour in which I saw her, and asked her to be my wife 3 days before I discovered her claim to John Haygarth's estate. A man can't go through the world with his justification pinned upon his breast. I think it will be my fate to be misjudged all my life. A 12-month ago I cared very little about the opinions of my fellow men, but I want to be worthy of my wife in the esteem of mankind, as well as in the depths of my own moral consciousness." "Go and finish your honeymoon," said the lawyer, digging his client in the ribs with elephantine playfulness. "The moon must be in her first quarter, I should think. Go along with you, and leave me to tackle Mr. George Sheldon." CHAPTer 3. Greek against Greek.
Book the 10th, Chapter 4 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Céline Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 4. Only a Dream. "I say, Lenoble," Captain Paget began abruptly one afternoon when his daughter and his future son-in-law were in attendance upon his sofa, "when are you and Diana to be married? There is nothing to hinder your marriage now, you know." Diana looked at the speaker with a grave countenance. "Dear papa, there can be no marriage while you are so ill," she said gently. "And afterwards, when I'm gone? You won't like to marry within 6 months of your father's funeral, and you will be left alone in the world. You can't hang on to Hawkehurst and his wife. The best thing you can do, Lenoble, is to marry her out of hand, and let me see her by my bedside as Madame Lenoble of Côtenoir. It will be some consolation for me to see that day. I thought to have shared your home, with a run to Paris occasionally, just to freshen myself up a little, but that's all over now. It does seem rather hard to me sometimes. And I think of Moses, and his 40 years in the desert with those ill-conditioned Israelites, who were always getting into some scrape or other, setting up golden calves and that kind of thing, if he turned his back on them for 24 hours. A pack of ungrateful beggars, too, always ready for mutiny, regular radicals, begad! And he went through it all, the sand, the toujours quails, and the ingratitude. And after 40 years of it, when he saw the promised land stretched before him green and fertile on the other side of the river, he died. I've been through my desert, the dreary wanderings over the barren sand, and the ingratitude of men I've served. Yes, gone through it all, and just as I catch a glimpse of Canaan, the curtain drops." On this they comforted him, and sustained him with the promise of a brighter Canaan than Côtenoir. "Yes," he said in a dreamy voice, "I read about it very often. A city with foundations of jasper and chalcedony, emerald and sardonyx, gates of pearl, pavements of gold. That's what St. John the Evangelist saw in his vision, and we've only his word for it. But there's something that I can believe and can understand. In my Father's house there are many mansions. There's more hope for a sinful man of the world in that promise than in all St. John's dreams about gates of pearl and foundations of emerald." The Captain was failing fast. He had exchanged his easy chair for a sofa now, and the time seemed near at hand when he must exchange the sofa for his bed. After that there would remain but one last change, to the contemplation whereof the sick man was becoming daily more reconciled. He had read his Gospel more diligently of late, and had taken comfort from those sublime pages. Do they not contain consolation, hope, promise for all, for the weary man of the world, as well as for the saint? There is to be found the only creed that can adapt itself to every condition of life, and has a margin wide enough for every weakness of erring humanity. Buddhism may contain a scheme of morality almost as perfect. Mahomet may have expounded hopes that seem well nigh as divine. But in the Gospel is the only system that will adapt itself at once to the culture of the spiritual man, and the active life of the practical worker in this lower world. Gustave Lenoble was only too glad to claim his promised wife a little sooner than he had hoped to claim her. "Thou hast put me off long enough, cruel," he said, "and now it is thy father's wish that our marriage should be soon. It shall be this week. I will take no longer thine excuses. We shall be the sooner ready to receive thy friends, thy Charlotte, and her Hawkehurst." Diana smiled. "Dear Gustave, you are always kind." It was very sweet to her to think that her new home would afford a pleasant haven for that dear friend who had sheltered her; and with Charlotte, the dear adopted sister, would come the man she had once loved, to share whose cares had once been the brightest dream. She wondered at her own inconsistency on perceiving how completely the dream had flown. Before the stern realities of life, before sickness and sorrow and the dread shadow of death, that schoolgirl's vision had utterly melted away. It is just possible that Gustave's manly outspoken love may have helped to blot from the tablet of her mind the fantastic picture of the life that might have been. She scarcely knew whether this was so, but she did know that a new and happier existence began for her from the hour in which she gave her heart in all truth and loyalty to Gustave Lenoble. The wedding was arranged to take place within a week of Captain Paget's expressly declared wish. It was to be solemnized at a church near Knightsbridge, and again at a Catholic chapel in the neighbourhood of Sloane Street, by which double ceremonial a knot would be tied that no legal quibble could hereafter loosen. Charlotte was just sufficiently recovered to obtain permission to be present at the ceremonial, after some little exercise of her persuasive powers with the medical practitioner to whose care Dr. Jedd had committed her when all danger was past. The Captain protested, with an eager insistence, that the wedding breakfast should be eaten at his domicile. "And Val," he said, "be sure Val is with you. I have a secret to tell him, a kind of atonement to make. Some news to give him that he won't quite relish, perhaps, but that's no fault of mine." "No bad news, I hope, papa, for Charlotte's sake as well as for Valentine's." "That depends upon how they both take it. Your friend Charlotte is not particularly fond of money, is she?" "Fond of money, papa? A baby knows as much of the value of money as Lotta. Except to give to beggars in the streets, or to buy pretty, frivolous presents for her friends, she has neither use nor desire for money. She is the most generous, most disinterested of created beings." "I'm very glad to hear it," said the Captain dryly. "And how about Hawkehurst, now? Do you think it was a real love match, his marriage with Miss Halliday? No arrière pensée? No looking out for the main chance at the bottom of his romantic attachment, Di?" "No, papa. I am sure there was never truer love than his. I saw him under most trying circumstances, and I can pledge myself for the truth of his devotion." "I am very glad to hear it. Be sure you bring Hawkehurst and his wife to my little breakfast. A chicken, a pine, a bottle of sparkling hock, and a fond father's blessing are all I shall give you, but the chicken and the hock will be from Gunter, and the blessing from the bottom of a paternal heart." Bright shone the day that gave Diana to her husband, and very beautiful looked the bride in her simple dress. Gustave Lenoble's marriage was no less quietly performed than that union which had secured the safety of Charlotte Halliday and the happiness of Valentine Hawkehurst. The shadow of death hovered very near bride and bridegroom, for they knew full well that he who was to preside that day at their simple marriage feast would soon have tasted that last sacred cup which has no after flavour of bitterness. The breakfast promised by the Captain was arranged with much elegance: hothouse flowers and fruits, wines with the ice dew sparkling on the dark glass, chickens and tongue, idolized by the confectioner's art, and scarcely recognizable beneath rich glazings and embellishments of jellies and forcemeats, the airiest and least earthly of lobster salads, and a pyramid of coffee ice testified to the glory of the Belgravian purveyor. It had been pleasant to Captain Paget to send his orders to Gunter, certain of funds to meet the bill. It was almost a glimpse of that land of milk and honey, that Canaan in Normandy, which he was never to inhabit. He was very weak, very ill; but the excitement of the occasion in some measure sustained and revivified him. The man who had been engaged to nurse and wait upon him had attired him with much care in a dressing gown as elegant as the robe in which he had disported himself, a penniless young cornet, in his luxurious garrison quarters, some 50 years before. His loose white locks were crowned with an embroidered smoking cap, his patrician instep was set off by a dainty scarlet slipper. He had put away the gospel, and all thoughts of that dread reckoning which he had really some shadowy desire and hope to settle satisfactorily, by some poor dividend which might discharge his obligations to that merciful creditor who forgives so many just debts, To-day he was of the world, worldly. He was a kind of ante mortem lying in state, his last levee; and he was equal to the occasion. The prettily adorned table was drawn near the sofa where the invalid host reclined, supported by numerous pillows. His daughter and her husband, Valentine, Charlotte, and Georgie, made a little circle about him. His own man and a clerical looking person from Gunter's assisted at the airy banquet. Very little was eaten by any of the guests, and it was a relief to every one when the clerical personage and Captain Paget's factotum retired, after serving tea and coffee with funereal solemnity. Valentine Hawkehurst was all gentleness and cordiality towards his old taskmaster. The wrong must indeed be dire which is considered in such an hour as this. Valentine remembered only that with this old man he had seen many troubled days, and that for him the end of all earthly wanderings was very near. The little banquet was not served in Captain Paget's ordinary sitting room. For this distinguished occasion the landlady had lent a dining room and drawing room on the ground floor, just deserted by a fashionable bachelor lodger who had left town at the close of the season. This drawing room on the ground floor, like the room above, overlooked the park, and to this apartment the Captain requested his guests to adjourn, with the exception of Mr. Hawkehurst, some little time after the departure of the servants. "I want to have a few words with Val in private," he said. "I have a secret to communicate. Diana, show Mrs. Hawkehurst the drive. You can see the Bow from my room, but not from these lower windows. There are a good many carriages still, but it is too late for the crême de la crême. I remember when the West End was a desert at this time of year. But I have lived to see the levelling of all distinctions, those of time as well as of class." Charlotte and Diana retired to the adjoining room with Mrs. Sheldon and M. Lenoble. Valentine was at a loss to imagine what manner of confidential communication his late patron and employer could desire to impart to him. The cautious Horatio waited until the rest of the party were quite out of hearing, talking gaily by the open window, beyond which appeared all the fluttering life and motion of summer leaves, all the brightness of summer green below, and deep blue sky above. When they seemed to him to be quite engaged with their own conversation, Captain Paget turned to his old companion. "Val," he said, "we have seen hard times together. We've roughed it among strange places and strange people, you know, and so on. And I think there is a friendly kind of feeling between us." He held out his poor wasted hand, and Valentine grasped it firmly in his own with prompt cordiality. "My dear governor, I have no feeling in my heart that is not friendly to you." This was perfectly true. "And even if I had been inclined to bear any grudge against you on account of the old days, when, you know, you were a little apt to be indifferent as to what scrape you left me in, provided you got off scot-free yourself, if I had been inclined to remember that kind of thing, which on my honour I am not, your daughter's noble courage and devotion in the time of my dear wife's peril should have stood against that old wrong. I cannot tell you how deeply I feel her goodness in that bitter time." "She is a Paget," murmured the Captain complacently. "Noblesse oblige." Valentine could scarcely refrain from a smile, as he remembered the many occasions upon which the obligations of a noble lineage had weighed very lightly on his aristocratic patron. "Yes, Val," the Captain resumed in a dreamy tone, "we have seen many strange things together. When I began my travels through this world, in the palmy days of the Regency, I little thought what a weary journey it was to be, and what queer people I was to encounter among my fellow passengers. However, I've come to the last stage of the long journey now, and I thank Providence that it ends so comfortably." To this Valentine assented kindly, but he was at a loss to understand why Captain Paget should have required the adjournment of the rest of the party before giving utterance to these mild commonplaces. For some moments the invalid relapsed into thoughtful silence. Then, rousing himself as if with an effort, he took a few sips of a cooling drink that stood by his side, and began with a startling abruptness. "You remember your journey to Dorking, Val, last October, when you went to see that mysterious old aunt of yours, eh?" Valentine blushed as the Captain recalled this cunningly devised fable. "Yes," he said gravely. I remember telling you that I was going to see an aunt at Dorking." "An aunt who had a little bit of money, eh, Val?" asked the Captain, with a grin. "Yes, I may have gone so far as to speak of a little bit of money." "And neither the aunt nor the bit of money ever existed, eh, Val? They were mere figments of the brain. And instead of going to Dorking you went to Ullerton, eh, Val? You stole a march upon me there. You wanted to throw your old chum off the scent, eh? You thought you had got hold of a good thing, and you were afraid your friend and companion might get a share of it." "Well, you see my friend and companion had a knack of getting the lion's share. Besides, this good thing was not my own affair. I had to protect the interest of another person, my employer, in point of fact, and it was by his suggestion, and in compliance with his request, that I invented that harmless fiction about Dorking. I don't think there was any dishonourable dealing in the matter. We were soldiers of fortune, both, and the stratagem with which I protected myself against you was a very innocent one. You would have employed any stratagem or invented any fiction under the same circumstances. It was a case of diamond cut diamond." "Precisely. And if the older soldier, if the free lance of many a campaign, got the best of it in the long run, the younger freebooter could hardly think himself ill used, could he now, Val?" "Well, no, I suppose not," replied Valentine, puzzled by the significance in the face of his old companion. That sly twinkle in the Captain's eyes, that triumphant smile wreathing the Captain's lips, must surely mean mischief. Valentine Hawkehurst remembered the vague suspicion that had flashed into his mind on that Christmas Eve, when Captain Paget and he had dined together at the West End restaurant, and the Captain had toasted Charlotte Halliday with a smile of sinister meaning. He began to anticipate some startling and unpleasant revelation. He began to understand that in some manner this inscrutable schemer had contrived to overreach him. "What are you going to tell me?" he asked. "I see there is some lurking mischief in your mind. How was it you were at Ullerton when I was there? I met you on the platform of the station, and I had a vague half suspicion that you followed me up on more than one occasion. I saw a glove in a man's parlour, a glove which I could have sworn to as yours. But when I came back, you were so plausible with your talk of promoting business and so on, that I was fool enough to believe you. And I suppose you cheated and tricked me after all?" "Cheated and tricked are hard words, my dear Val," said the Captain with delightful blandness. "I had as much right to transact imaginary business in the promoting line at Ullerton as you had to visit a fictitious aunt at Dorking. Self-interest was the governing principle in both cases." "I do not think you can have any right to consider yourself injured by me, if I did steal a march upon you and follow close upon your heels throughout that Ullerton business. I do not think that you can have, on moral grounds, any justification for making a complaint against your old ally." "Well, I suppose you are right enough in that," said Valentine. "Shake hands upon it, then. I have not very long to live, and I want to feel myself at peace with mankind. You see, if you had come to me in the first place in a frank and generous spirit and had said, 'My dear friend, here is a good thing, let us go into it together, and see what there is to be made out of it,' you would have placed the matter on such a footing that, as a man of honour, I should have been bound to regard your interests as my own. But when you set up a separate interest, when you try to throw dust in my eyes, to hoodwink me, Horatio Paget, a man of the world, possessed of some little genius for social diplomacy, you attempt to do that which no man ever yet succeeded in doing, and you immediately release me from those obligations which an honourable man holds sacred. It was my glove which you saw in Mr. Goodge's parlour. I had a very satisfactory interview with that reverend person while you were absent from Ullerton on some short excursion, as to the purpose of which I am still in the dark. On certain terms Mr. Goodge agreed to give me the privilege of selecting a stated number from the letters of Mrs. Rebecca Haygarth. I have reason to believe that I made a judicious choice, for the information thus obtained placed me at once upon a track which I followed industriously until it led me to a triumphant result." "I do not understand," began Valentine, but the Captain did not allow him to say more. You do not understand that there could be any other genealogical line than that which you and George Sheldon fitted together so neatly. You have neither of you the experience of life which alone gives wideness of vision. You discovered the connections of the Haygarth and the Meynell families in the past. That was a step in the right direction. The discovery, so far as it went, was a triumph. You allowed the sense of that triumph to intoxicate you. In a business which of all businesses within the range of man's intellect most requires deliberation and sobriety, you went to work in a fever of haste and excitement. Instead of searching out all the descendants of Christian Meynell, you pounce upon the first descendant who comes to hand, and elect her, at your own pleasure, sole heiress to the estate of the deceased John Haygarth. You forget that there may be other descendants of the said Christian Meynell, descendants standing prior to your wife Charlotte in the line of succession." "I can imagine no such descendants existing," said Valentine, with a puzzled manner. "You seem to have made yourself master of our business; but there is one point upon which you are mistaken. George Sheldon and I did not go to work in a fever of haste. We did fully and thoroughly examine the pedigree of that person whom we, and legal advisers of considerable standing, believed to be the sole heir at law to the Haygarth estate, and we took good care to convince ourselves that there was no other claimant in existence." "What do you call convincing yourselves?" "Christian Meynell had only 3 children, Samuel, Susan, and Charlotte. The last, Charlotte, married James Halliday, of Newhall and Highley Farms. The other 2 died unmarried." "How do you know that?" "How do you propose to demonstrate that Samuel and Susan Meynell died unmarried?" "Susan was buried in her maiden name. Mrs. Halliday, her sister, was with her when she died. There was no question of marriage, nor is there the record of any marriage contracted by Samuel." "All that is no proof." "Indeed! I should have thought the evidence sufficient. But in any case, the onus probandi is not upon us. Can you prove the marriage of the Samuel Meynell who died at Calais, or of the Susan Meynell who died in London?" "I can. Susan Meynell's legitimate son is in the next room. It's an unpleasant kind of revelation to make, Val, as he, the son of one sister, stands prior to your wife, the granddaughter of the other sister, in the order of succession. And he takes all." "He takes all?" repeated Valentine, bewildered. "He, Susan Meynell's son? In the next room? What does all this mean?" "It means that when Susan was deserted by the scoundrel who took her away from her home, she found an honest fellow to marry her. The name of her husband was Lenoble. Gustave Lenoble yonder, my daughter's husband, is her only child by that marriage. A perfectly legal marriage, my dear Val. Everything en règle, I assure you. The business is in the hands of Messrs. Dashwood and Vernon of Whitehall, a first-class firm. Counsel's opinion most decided as to Lenoble's position. They have been rather slow about the preliminary steps, and, entre nous, I have not cared to hurry them, for I wanted to get my daughter's marriage over quietly before we began our proceedings in Chancery. It comes rather hard upon you, Val, I allow. But you see, if you had acted generously, not to say honourably, towards me in the first instance, you'd have had the advantage of my experience. As it is, you have been working in the dark. However, things are not so bad as they might be. You might have married some ugly old harridan for the sake of this Haygarth estate. You have secured a pretty and amiable wife, and you mustn't be downhearted if you find yourself, from a financial point of view, most outrageously sold." The Captain could not refrain from a laugh as he contemplated his young friend's surprise. The laugh degenerated into a fit of coughing, and it was some little time before the enfeebled Horatio was ready to resume the interrupted conversation. In this pause Valentine had leisure to face this new position. There was for the moment a sharp sense of disappointment. It is not possible for humanity to be quite indifferent to 100,000 pounds. So much of the light and sweetness of life is attainable for that sum. Such pleasures, of the purest and noblest, are in the power of the possessor. But in this moment Valentine fully realized the fact that he had never taken the idea of this fortune into his mind, never made it part and parcel of himself, to be plucked out of his heart with anguish, and to leave a bleeding wound in the place where it had grown. It seemed to him as if he had been wakened abruptly from some bright, bewildering dream. But the sharp pang of mercenary desires disappointed, of sordid hopes suddenly reft, was not for him. Beyond this sense of uncertainty, which had made the Haygarthian fortune seem at best such stuff as dreams are made of, there had been ever present in his mind of late the dismal association connected with this money. For this, and to get power over this through the rights of his weak wife, had Philip Sheldon plotted against the life of that sweet girl who was but newly rescued from the jaws of the grave. The bitter memory of those days and nights of suspense could never have been quite dissociated from the money that had been the primary cause of all this slow torture. "Do you think I shall love my wife any less because she has no claim to the Haygarth estate?" he exclaimed presently, looking with half contemptuous indignation upon the broken down Bohemer. "I loved her long before I knew the name Haygarth. I should have loved her if I had found her a beggar in the London streets, a peasant girl weeding for sixpence a day in some dismal swamp of agricultural poverty and ignorance. I am not going to say that this money would not have brought us pleasure, pictures and gardens, and bright rooms, and books without number, and intercourse with congenial acquaintance, and delightful journeyings to all the fairest places upon the earth, and the power to do some good in our generation, and a sense of security for our future, and by and by, perhaps, for the future of dear children, for whose prosperity we should be more anxious than for our own. Pleasure the money would most probably have brought for us in abundance, but I doubt if it could buy us more perfect happiness than we may know in the simplest home that my toil can support. Ah, Captain, I question if you ever knew the sweetest sensation life can give, the delight of working for those we love." Captain Paget stared at his sometime protégé in a kind of rapture of wonder, not entirely unmingled with admiration. "Egad!" he exclaimed, "I have read of this kind of thing in novels, but in the whole course of my experience I never met with anything equal to it. My son-in-law, Lenoble yonder, is a generous fellow enough; but then, since infancy, he has never known the want of money; and generosity from that kind of man is no more of a virtue than the foolhardiness of a child who pokes his finger into the candle, not knowing the properties of the thing he has to deal with. But anything like generosity from you, from a man reared as you were reared, is, I freely confess, a little beyond my comprehension." "Yes, it is a transformation, is it not? But I don't think I was ever inordinately fond of money. Your genuine Bohemian rarely is. He is too well schooled in the art of living without cash, and he asks so little here below. His pipe, his friend, his dog, his books, his garret, his billiards, his beer. It is all a question of a few pounds a week; and if, some day, the divine enchanter Love takes the poor fellow under his guidance, and teaches him to do without billiards and beer, your Bohemian settles down into the purest and best of men. Think what gold he might have been if some good woman had taken compassion upon him and married him, and henpecked him ever afterwards. He might have written as many novels as Sir Walter Scott, and died master of some Hibernian Abbotsford, some fair domain among the bright green hills that look down upon broad Shannon's silvery falls. No, Captain, your intelligence has not annihilated me. I can face the future boldly with my dear young wife upon my arm." "Upon my soul, Val, you're a very noble fellow!" exclaimed Horatio Paget, with real enthusiasm, "and I am sorry I have kept you in the dark so long." "You have kept me in the dark? Yes, to be sure. How long have you known this about Susan Meynell?" "Well, my dear boy, not very long." "But how long? A month? 2 months?" "Yes. You have known Lenoble's position ever since you knew him; and Charlotte told me 3 months ago of Diana's engagement to Lenoble. Do you know that if Sheldon had succeeded, Charlotte's blood would have been upon your head? If you had not concealed the truth, his villainy would never have been attempted." "But, my dear Val," exclaimed the Captain piteously, I was not to know." "No, you were not to know that there could be such a wretch as Philip Sheldon upon this earth. We will say no more of that. I kept my secret, you kept yours. Mischief unspeakable well nigh came of all this underhand work. But Heaven has been merciful to us. We have passed through the valley of the shadow of death. And if anything could make my wife dearer to me than she was when first I won her promise to be mine, it would be the sorrow of the last few months. And now I will go and shake hands with Lenoble, my wife's kinsman. He is a fine fellow, and well deserves his good fortune. Stay, one word. Did Diana know this? Did she know that her lover is heir to the Haygarth estate?" "She does not know it now. She has never heard the name of Haygarth. And between you and me, Val, it cost me a world of trouble to persuade her to say yes to Lenoble's offer, though he is a very decent match for her, even without reference to the Haygarth estate." "I am glad she knew nothing of this," said Valentine. "I am very glad." After this, he again shook hands with Captain Paget, at that gentleman's request, and the Captain expressed himself much relieved by the conversation, and by his late protégée's very generous behaviour. He called to his daughter and the rest presently, and they came at his summons. "Is your long talk finished, papa?" asked Diana. "And is the secret told?" demanded Charlotte of her obedient husband and slave. "Yes, dear, it is told," he answered gravely. "I hope it is a pleasant secret." "I do not think the knowledge of it will give you much pain, dearest. You have learnt to think yourself a kind of an heiress of late, have you not?"
"Papa, Mr. Sheldon told me that I had a claim to some money, but I have not thought much about it, except that I should give you groat and Macaulay in dark brown calf, with bevelled boards and red edges, like that edition you saw at the auctioneer's in Bond Street, and have talked about ever since, and a horse perhaps, and a glass porch to our cottage."
"Well, darling, the books in dark brown calf, and the horse, and the glass porch may all be ours in the future, but the money was only a dream. It has melted away, dear."
"Is that all?" asked Charlotte. "Why, I dare say the day will come when you will be as rich as Sir Walter Scott."
"In the meantime I have something to give you instead of the money."
"Indeed?"
"Yes, a cousin. Will that do as well, my love?"
"A cousin? I shall like her very much if she is nice."
"The cousin I mean is a gentleman."
"But where is he to come from?" cried Charlotte, laughing.
"Has he dropped from the moon?"
"The only relations I have the world are Uncle and Aunt Mercer. How can you pretend to find me a cousin?"
"Do you remember telling me of your grandmother's only sister, Susan Meynell?"
"Yes," said Charlotte, with a sudden blush, "I remember."
"That Miss Meynell married a gentleman of Normandy, and left one only child, a son. His name is Gustave Lenoble, and he is standing by your side. He is heir at law to a very large fortune, which it was once supposed you could claim. Are you sorry, Lotta, to find a kinsman and lose a fortune? And are you contented to begin the world with no hope except in your husband's patience and courage?"
"And genius!"
cried Charlotte with enthusiasm. The sweet, blinding glamour of love shone upon this young scribbler, and she believed that he was indeed worthy to take rank among the greatest of that grand brotherhood of which he was so humble a member. She looked up at him with the prettiest confidence, her clinging hand clasped his with love and trust immeasurable. He felt and knew that love like this was a treasure beside which the Reverend John Haygarth's hoarded thousands must needs seem but sorry dross. After this there was much explanation and congratulation. Gustave Lenoble was delighted to claim so fair a kinswoman. "Thou art like my eldest, my cousin," he said. "Diana saw the likeness at the Sacré Coeur when she beheld my daughter, and I too saw my eldest's look in thine eyes when I first met thee. Remember, it was convened between us that Côtenoir should be a home for thee and for Hawkehurst, before I knew what link bound thee to the house of Lenoble. Now thou and thy husband will be of our family." Diana was bewildered, grieved, indignant with the father who had deceived her by his studious suppression of the truth. She found herself placed in the position of rival to Charlotte, and the whole proceeding seemed to her mean and treacherous. But it was no time for remonstrance or open expression of indignant feeling. Her father's days were numbered. She knew this, and she held her peace. Nor did Mrs. Sheldon utter any word of complaint, though the disappointment she experienced upon hearing this revelation was very keen. The idea of the £4,000 or £5,000 which were to come to Charlotte had been a consolation to her in the midst of that confusion and desolation which had newly come upon her life. She left Knightsbridge that evening somewhat depressed in spirits, and half inclined to be angry with Charlotte and her husband for their gaiety of manner, and evident happiness in each other's society. "It seems hard to have to begin the world at my age," she murmured hopelessly, "after being accustomed to have everything nice about me, as I had at the Lawn, though I own that the trouble and care of the servants was wearing me to the grave." "Dear mamma," exclaimed Charlotte tenderly, "there is no fear of trouble or poverty for you or for us. Valentine has plenty of money, and is on the high road to securing a comfortable income. Authors do not starve in garrets now, you know, as they used to do, poor things, when Dr. Johnson ate his dinner in a cave, or something dreadful of that kind; and when Sir Richard Steele thought it quite a wonderful thing to get a pound of tea for his wife. And Valentine's heart is in his profession, and he will work for us." "As long as I have a hand that can write and a brain that can guide my pen," interposed Mr. Hawkehurst gaily, "I have given hostages to fortune. I can face the hazard boldly. I feel as confident and as happy as if we lived in the golden age, when there was neither care nor toil for innocent mankind, and all the brightest things of earth were the spontaneous gift of the gods." End of Chapter 4. Read by Céline Major. Book the 10th, Chapter 5 of Charlotte's Inheritance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Céline Major. Charlotte's Inheritance by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 5. Bohemian Independence. Monsieur and Madame Lenoble went to Brighton for their honeymoon. A letter or a telegraphic message would bring them thence swiftly to the bedside of the dying Captain, should the last fatal change set in suddenly. Diana had wished to stay with her father, but Horatio insisted upon the honeymoon trip, and that everything should be done in a correct and gentlemanly manner. "You can engage rooms at the Albion," Captain Paget had said to his son-in-law a few days before the quiet wedding. "The house is extremely comfortable, and you will be received by a compatriot. The proprietor is a Frenchman, a very gentlemanly person, I assure you, the cuisine irreproachable. I remember the old Stein when Mrs. Fitzherbert lived close by, and received all the best people, in the days when the Cockney had not yet taken possession of Brighthelmstone, and the Chinese dragons and pagodas were bright and fresh in the pavilion." To Brighton, therefore, the bride and bridegroom departed, Diana attended by a maid, an appanage which the Captain had insisted upon. Poor Diana was sorely puzzled as to what she should find for the maid to do when her hair had been dressed early in the morning, and her costume laid out in state for the day. "I think I must buy some handkerchiefs for her to hem," she said to Gustave. "It will be quite dreadful for her to have nothing to do all day long." The weather was warm and bright. The sea danced and sparkled under the windows. Gustave was always in the same happy frame of mind. An elegant landau had been secured for the period of their visit, and a pair of capital horses carried them out on long and pleasant expeditions to the pretty Sussex villages, or across the broad bare downs, beyond which the sea stretched blue and bright. In the evening, when the lamp was lighted and the urn hissed gaily, Diana felt that she and her husband were at home. It was the first home she had known, the first time she had been sole mistress and centre of a household. She looked back at all the old desolation, the dreary shifting from lodging to lodging, the degradation, the self-abasement, the dull apathy of despair; and then she looked across at her husband as he lounged in his easy-chair, contemplating her with dreamy adoring eye, in a kind of lazy worship, and she knew that for this man she was the centre of the universe, the very keystone in the arch of life. She stretched out her hand to him with a smile, and he pressed it fondly to his lips. There were twinkling jewels upon the slender fingers, for the prettiest shop in Brighton, the brightest shop in Brighton, had been ransacked that morning by the fond, frivolous, happy husband, as pleased to bedeck his wife as a child to dress her last new doll. "How can I ever be worthy of so much affection, Gustave?" she exclaimed as he kissed the twinkling fingers. And it did seem indeed to her that for this free gift of love she could never render a sufficient recompense. "Thou will make Côtenoir a home," he said. "Thou knowest not how I have sighed for a home. This room, with the lamplight shining on thy face, and thy white hands moving about the teacups, and thy sweet smile, which greets me every now and then when thou lookest by here, it is more of home than I have ever known since I left Beaubocage, that modest dwelling where lived those two angels of kindness, my aunt and my grandmother." In one of those long pleasant drives to a distant village nestling under the lee of a steep hill, the husband and wife had much serious talk about the position of the former with reference to the Haygarth estate. The result of that conversation was shown in a letter which Charlotte Hawkehurst received the next day from her friend Diana Lenoble. Albion Hotel, Brighton. Ever dear Lotta, Gustave and I have discussed the Haygarth business with great satisfaction to ourselves, since it transpired in the course of our conversation that we are both of one mind in the matter. It is agreed between us that, as he is very well off already, and as he never hoped or expected to inherit a fortune from his maternal ancestor, it is only just that he should divide this unlooked for wealth with his dear cousin, whose claim to that inheritance he recognises as equal to his own, the mere fact of seniority making only a legal and not a moral difference in the degree of relationship to the Reverend John Haygarth. Do you understand, darling? You are to have half this money. My husband will not step in between you and good fortune. I cannot tell you how happy this determination of Gustave's has made me. I felt myself in a manner base and ungrateful when I thought I was to share wealth that might have been yours. But I ought to have better understood the justice of my husband's mind. And now, dearest, all will be arranged very simply. Gustave will come to London and see his lawyers, and execute some kind of deed, and the whole affair will be settled. We have had some charming drive," etc., etc. Here the young bride branched off into a description of the simple pleasures of their honeymoon holiday. This letter was answered by Valentine Hawkehurst in person. He came down to Brighton to thank his friends for their generous desire to enrich his wife, and to decline, on her part, any share in John Haygarth's wealth. It was in vain that Gustave and Diana argued the point. Mr. Hawkehurst was fixed as fate. "Believe me, it is better as it is," he said. "Charlotte and I have arrived at this conviction with all due thought and deliberation. We are both young, and the world is all before us. There is much in the past that I have to redeem, as Diana well knows. It is better that I should fight the battle of life unaided, and rise from the ranks by right of my merit as a soldier. If ever we have need of help, if ever I find myself breaking down, you may be sure that it is to you I shall come. By and by, if Providence gives me children to work for, I will refuse no bounty that you may bestow on them. Their future may be rendered secure by your generosity, if you please, Lenoble. They will be your kindred. But for an alien like myself there is no discipline so wholesome as honest hard work. I am as rich as John Milton when he set up school in St. Bride's churchyard." To this resolution Mr. Hawkehurst adhered with a gentle firmness. "Thou art chivalrous like Don Quixote," said Gustave Lenoble. "But it shall be as thou wouldest. Touch there." He offered his hand, which the other grasped with all heartiness. "I will be godfather to thy little first one, and I will settle on him 10,000 pounds before he cuts his first tooth," said Gustave decisively. Chapter 6. Read by Céline Major.